Judged by their appearance, Mr. and Mrs. Brooks, the owners of an airline, were stopped for boarding first class by flight attendant Melissa Carter. When the truth came to light, instead of punishing her, they offered her a chance to make things right. Melissa gradually changed, learning to see people with her heart rather than her assumptions. The story closes on a hopeful note. A new person was born from undeniable mistakes. Let's follow the extraordinary journey of Melissa Carter. Summit International Airport buzzed with the familiar sounds of rapid-fire announcements and the steady clatter of suitcase wheels gliding across the polished tile floors. In the first-class lounge area, warm light bathed the room, where well-dressed passengers waited leisurely for Flight 172 to Seattle. Olivia Reed, a young flight attendant who had just finished checking the passenger list, clutched her clipboard tighter when she spotted two names bolded at the top: Samuel and Helen Brooks. For a moment, she froze, thinking to herself, they're really here. At that very moment, from down the corridor, an elderly couple strolled forward. He wore a navy blue wool jacket and leather shoes worn thin at the heels, his hand gently holding hers. The woman with neatly pinned silver hair and a simple yet elegant pearl-colored silk dress. No flashy jewelry, no sign of showing off. Only the calm, steady presence of people who had weathered life storms. Melissa Carter, the veteran lead flight attendant for Orion Airways, stood waiting at the boarding gate. Her eyes swept quickly over the couple as they approached. For a brief second, her face stiffened. Melissa forced a professional smile, the kind she reserved for passengers she deemed problematic. When Samuel Brooks handed her their tickets, Melissa glanced at them without truly checking. Based on their simple appearance alone, she had already made her judgment. She blocked their path with a polite yet rigid motion and spoke in a chilly tone. "I'm sorry, this area is reserved for first-class passengers. Economy boarding is through the other gate." Helen smiled gently, calmly holding the tickets closer. "We do have first-class tickets, miss." Melissa barely glanced at the tickets before shaking her head. "Perhaps you were mistakenly upgraded. Orion Airways maintains strict standards for first class." Her words rang out just loudly enough for the waiting passengers behind to hear. A few curious eyes drifted toward them. A woman wearing oversized sunglasses whispered to her companion with a sneer. "Probably bought last-minute discounted seats." Nearby, Christopher Hayes, a businessman dressed in a crisp gray suit, frowned as he caught the tone in Melissa's voice. He lowered his Wall Street Journal, his sharp gaze following the unfolding scene. Samuel Brooks remained silent, his dark eyes glinting with patience. And something deeper, a kind of understanding, a wearied endurance all too familiar. Helen simply gave his hand a gentle squeeze, a signal. Let them reveal themselves. Melissa, still unwilling to check the manifest, simply waved her hand dismissively. "Please use the other lane so you don't block the boarding line." Helen's expression remained serene, and she asked softly, "Are you sure you've checked the list carefully?" Standing beside her, Olivia Reed gripped her clipboard tighter. She knew full well Samuel and Helen Brooks were not just first-class passengers. They were the owners of Orion Airways itself. But under Melissa's authoritative gaze, Olivia swallowed her words, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. In that moment, no one realized that Melissa Carter had just made a mistake that would forever alter the course of her career, a mistake born from a simple act of prejudice. Samuel Brooks gently squeezed his wife's hand, his gaze unshaken. Under the golden lights of the boarding gate, he looked like a stone in the winter wind, steady, calm, untouched by the clear disrespect rising minute by minute. Helen Brooks tilted her head slightly, the smile never leaving her lips, although in her eyes, a weary wisdom began to shine through. They were all too accustomed to looks like these, those quick, judging glances based on clothes, on skin color, on biases rooted deep within others' consciousness. Melissa Carter, unaware that their silence was a mirror reflecting her own actions, continued, "I truly hope you understand that we must maintain the comfort of our first-class passengers. Service standards here are very high." Her voice was sweet on the surface, but beneath it laced with condescension and quiet prejudice. She cast a quick glance over Samuel and Helen's shoulders, noting several passengers silently observing. She believed she was doing the right thing, protecting the standards of the first-class cabin. Olivia Reed, frozen behind the desk, clutched the passenger list harder. A vague unease swelled inside her. She knew the truth, and staying silent now made her feel complicit in something profoundly wrong. A sharp click echoed through the air as Christopher Hayes folded his newspaper, his serious gaze sweeping over Melissa. He said nothing, but his furrowed brow and subtle shrug said everything. In another corner, the woman with the oversized sunglasses, who had previously whispered mockingly, now hesitated slightly. Perhaps she, too, was beginning to realize this situation was not as simple as it first appeared. Samuel slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the boarding pass, holding it squarely in front of Melissa. He said nothing, letting her, and everyone behind her, see for themselves the words printed boldly, "First Class." Helen Brooks spoke gently, her voice like a flowing stream. "Perhaps you should check the list again, instead of judging us by appearances." For a brief moment, Melissa's expression faltered, but the pride rooted deep within her kept her smiling stiffly as she replied, "There must be some mistake somewhere. I'll have my colleague double-check. In the meantime, please step aside for the other passengers." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd behind them. A middle-aged woman muttered to her companion, "They don't seem out of place at all. Why are they being treated like that?" Christopher Hayes gave a small nod of agreement, his gaze shifting from the boarding pass back to Melissa's face, now slightly tense. Meanwhile, Samuel and Helen Brooks stood motionless, unshaken. Their calmness only heightened the awkwardness, laying bare the irrationality of Melissa's actions. Inside that small space called the first-class boarding lounge, the invisible lines between courtesy and prejudice, between authority and bias, were slowly being peeled back under the lights and the watching eyes of those present. A storm was quietly brewing, and Melissa Carter, oblivious, was pushing herself right into the center of it. Melissa gripped her clipboard tighter, as if it were the last shield protecting her from the creeping unease gnawing at her gut. The Brooks silence, combined with the suspicious glances from onlookers, made her feel control slipping from her grasp. Unable to bear it any longer, she grabbed her walkie-talkie and pressed the call button. Her voice clipped. "Summit Airport, this is Carter at Gate 3, Flight or 172. I need immediate assistance. 2 non-compliant passengers causing a disturbance in the first-class area." As her words echoed through the air, a few nearby passengers gasped. Causing a disturbance? The distinguished man who had calmly presented his boarding pass, and the woman who had smiled so gently. They had not once raised their voices, not once stepped out of line. No one, except Melissa, saw anything alarming about the pair. Christopher Hayes shook his head slightly and whispered to the woman sitting next to him, "She's digging her own grave." About 3 minutes later, 2 security officers in dark blue uniforms appeared, striding quickly toward the gate. One of them, Mason Clark, as his name tag read, spoke with a calm voice. "Good afternoon, Miss Carter. Can you tell us the issue?" Melissa pointed directly at Samuel and Helen Brooks, her voice rising sharply, cutting through the usual background noise. They refused to move to the economy section, despite clearly not holding first-class tickets. Mason Clark frowned and turned to Samuel. "I'm sorry, sir, ma'am. Could I please see your boarding passes?" With a calmness that was almost unsettling, Samuel Brooks once again produced the 2 tickets. As the security officer moved to verify the passes, the young flight attendant Olivia Reed hurried forward, almost whispering, "Their names have been on the first-class list from the beginning. I already checked." Her voice trembled, a mixture of fear and resolve. Mason's brow furrowed as he glanced at Olivia, then immediately and seriously inspected the tickets. He took them from Samuel's hand, eyes scanning the bold, unmistakable print. First class, seats 2A, 2B. A heavy silence fell over the area. Mason exchanged a look with the second officer, a young woman named Riley Hale, both instantly aware that something was very wrong here. Clearing his throat, Mason handed the boarding passes back to Samuel and turned toward Melissa, his voice firm. "Ms. Carter, these passengers are fully authorized. Their first-class tickets are official, no discrepancies whatsoever." The air seemed to freeze solid. A soft gasp escaped from a nearby row of seats. Olivia Reed, still standing frozen, looked like she wished she could sink into the floor. Melissa's face flushed bright red, but she tried to salvage the situation. "Then, that must be a system error. They couldn't possibly." "They could." Mason cut her off sharply. "And they are." Riley scanned the gathered crowd, which had now grown even larger, many faces showing a mixture of disappointment and disapproval. She even caught sight of Christopher Hayes, arms folded, glaring at Melissa with thinly veiled contempt. Flustered, Melissa took a step back. But before she could retreat, Helen Brooks spoke gently. "Ms. Carter, we said it from the beginning. Sometimes, what needs checking isn't the ticket, but the heart." The words hung in the air like a bell tolling through the thick, heavy tension. Melissa stood frozen as Samuel gave a slight, courteous nod, the gesture of a true gentleman, and calmly passed through the first-class gate, leaving the young attendant alone, exposed under the sharp, judging stares of the entire lounge. And the real storm had only just begun. Mason Clark tightened his grip on the boarding passes, a thoughtful look crossing his face. Something was stirring in his memory. The name Samuel Brooks, it wasn't unfamiliar. Not just from the ticket, but from the training manuals he had once read, a name tied to the very history of Orion Airways. He glanced at Riley Hale and murmured, "Riley, pull up the owner files from the system. Quick!" Riley immediately tapped in her task tablet, her fingers flying across the screen. Within 30 seconds, the results popped up and she froze. "Mason," she whispered. "He's the chairman of the board for Orion Airways." The air around Mason seemed to thicken. He took a deep breath, turned toward Melissa Carter, and his voice dropped, every word striking the floor like a hammer. "Ms. Carter, step over here. Now." Melissa, trying to shrink into a corner, reluctantly approached. The passengers were already glancing toward her, murmuring, speculating. Mason held the tablet up in front of her, the screen clearly displaying an image of Samuel and Helen Brooks, along with the words, "Founders and primary owners, Orion Airways." "These," Mason said coldly, "are the people you just insulted." For a moment, it seemed all the color drained from Melissa's face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her throat was dry as sandpaper. A wave of whispers rippled across the waiting area, swelling into an undercurrent of outrage from passengers who had once stayed silent. Just then, a middle-aged man, none other than Mr. Hayes, the sharply dressed businessman who had been observing all along, rose to his feet. He held up his phone. "I recorded the entire incident," he announced. "And if necessary, I'm willing to send this video straight to Orion Airways Media Relations Department." Melissa spun toward him, panic flashing across her features. No, that won't be necessary. I didn't know." Helen Brooks stepped forward, her voice warm but firm. "Not knowing," she interrupted, "is never an excuse for disrespect." The entire terminal fell into a stunned silence. Samuel Brooks smiled slightly, but his eyes were cold, sharp as a drawn blade. "We traveled anonymously on purpose," he said slowly, "because we believe how an airline treats its most ordinary passengers is the true measure of its professionalism." Under the soft yellow glow of the terminal lights, the lines of Samuel's face seemed to harden into something regal. No longer just a solitary elderly man, but a living symbol of quiet authority. Melissa staggered back, trembling as if the very ground beneath her feet were giving way. And at that very moment, another unexpected development occurred. The loudspeaker at Gate 3 crackled to life. The voice of Ronald Hatcher, the CEO of Orion Airways himself, broadcasted across the internal system. "Attention all staff. The incident at Flight or 172 is being formally recorded for urgent internal investigation. All personnel at the scene are ordered to preserve the situation exactly as is until further notice. A final blow, striking the last illusion Melissa Carter had been clinging to. Summit International Airport fell into stunned silence. But for Samuel and Helen Brooks, this was only the beginning. Samuel Brooks took a step forward, his hand resting loosely in the pocket of his jacket. His gesture was in no way threatening. It was calm, steady, but it was that very calmness that made Melissa Carter feel more suffocated than if he had shouted. He looked at her, his gaze sharp, piercing straight to her core. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice cutting cleanly through the tense air, "I have a very simple question for you." Melissa nodded shakily, as if any other movement might cause her to collapse. Samuel narrowed his eyes and asked, "When you saw us walk into the first-class boarding area, what exactly made you think we didn't belong?" There was no accusation in his voice, only curiosity, but that in itself was the sharpest blade. Melissa stammered, wringing her hands tightly. I just thought that." Helen Brooks stepped in gently, her voice soft but cutting. "Did you think it was because we weren't dressed like the first-class passengers you're used to? Or because we didn't look like the kind of people you associate with power?" A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd, all eyes fixed on Melissa, as if a spotlight had been cast directly on her. Melissa felt herself being torn apart. She struggled to piece together an explanation. I didn't mean to. Samuel cut her off, not rudely, but with firm decisiveness. "Do you realize that you made yourself judge and jury? That you decided, all on your own, who deserved dignity and who didn't?" Melissa bit her lip, her face burning red with shame. Samuel took another slow step forward, his voice dropping lower. "The saddest part, Ms. Carter, isn't that you judged incorrectly. It's that you never even bothered to verify the truth before making your decision. You simply looked and judged." A passenger behind them whispered, "Exactly. That's the real problem." Helen Brooks gave a faint, almost weary smile as she added, "We don't expect special treatment just because we happen to own this airline. What we expect, and what we demand, is that everyone, regardless of their skin color or the clothes they wear, be treated with equal respect." Her words struck Melissa like a hammer straight to the chest. At that moment, a little girl, no more than 7 years old, wearing a blue floral dress and clutching a doll, stepped out from the rows of seats. She tugged at her mother's hand and innocently asked, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Mommy, why does that lady hate the nice gray-haired people?" The simple question echoed across the boarding area, and no one needed an answer. Everyone already knew. Melissa Carter, pale as a sheet, barely whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry." Samuel gave a small nod, but there was no softening in his voice. An apology is a beginning, but change, that is the true answer. A slow, tentative applause broke out. A few claps at first, then swelling like a wildfire through a dry field. The passengers weren't just applauding Samuel and Helen. They were applauding the truth that had been laid bare. And for the first time in her career, Melissa Carter was forced to confront herself. As Melissa bowed her head in apology, Olivia Reed quietly nodded from the sidelines, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She realized, painfully, that she should have spoken up much earlier. She whispered to herself, "Next time, I won't stay silent." The boarding area fell into a strange, heavy silence after Melissa Carter's choked apology. But it wasn't a silence of forgiveness. It was a silence filled with expectation, judgment, and hope. Samuel Brooks slowly turned to Helen. They exchanged a brief glance. Nothing more than a flicker, but it was enough. Helen gave a small, approving nod. Samuel turned back to face Melissa, his voice warm but resolute. "Ms. Carter, we will not ask for you to be removed from this flight, and we will not allow you to leave in disgrace." Melissa lifted her head, a fragile glimmer of hope flashing in her eyes. Samuel crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes gleaming with an almost unnerving intensity. "But we are not going to let this pass as if it never happened." He paused, just long enough for Melissa to swallow hard, her hands tightening around a name tag pinned to her chest. "You have two choices," Samuel continued, each word striking with the weight of a hammer on an anvil. 1. Resign immediately and end your career at Orion Airways. A ripple of murmurs rose from the nearby rows. An elderly woman shook her head in dismay, while a young man stared wide-eyed at the scene unfolding before him. Melissa stood frozen, her lips trembling. "Or 2, Helen Brooks continued, her voice gentler but no less sharp. "You will enroll in a brand new program we have just approved, the Anti-Bias and Fair Service Training Course." A flicker of astonishment crossed Melissa's face. Samuel pressed on. "This program will last 6 months. It's not a checkbox course. It's not an online training where you click next and move on. You will undergo real-world exercises, critical discussions, and a complete reevaluation of how you perceive people." Helen tilted her head slightly. "It will be hard. It will be uncomfortable. And it will change you if you allow yourself to be changed." Melissa swallowed again, her throat dry as dust. The whispers among the passengers started to swell, like a low wind rustling through the boarding area. She should take it. She needs to relearn everything. Samuel Brooks took one final step closer, and now, the space between them was so tight Melissa could almost hear her own heart pounding in her ears. "Ms. Carter," he asked, his eyes never leaving hers, "which path will you choose?" No one forced her. No one shouted accusations. Yet the sheer weight of the silence pressing down was heavier than any scream. Melissa squeezed her eyes shut for a brief moment, as if wrestling with her own pride. Finally, she exhaled, shaky but unmistakably clear. I want to stay. I choose to enter the training." A few scattered claps broke out among the passengers, tentative but sincere, including the little girl in the blue floral dress, who grinned brightly and gave Melissa a big thumbs up. Helen Brooks offered a gentle smile. "All right, Ms. Carter. Welcome to the hardest day of your career." Samuel nodded in agreement, then turned and led Helen back to their seats. There was no need for further words. The choice had been made, and the future now rested in Melissa's hands. As for Melissa Carter, for the first time in her many years as a flight attendant, she realized there was nothing left she could take for granted. After her commitment rang out, the atmosphere inside the cabin seemed to ease, as if the entire plane had exhaled together. But within Melissa Carter, the storm had only just begun. She stood there, her uniform neat, but her mind teetering on collapse. Her hands clutched together tightly, seeking some kind of anchor amid the swirling storm of shame and regret. Samuel and Helen Brooks were seated quietly once again in seats 2A and 2B. They no longer looked at her. They didn't need to. The eyes of every other passenger were more than enough to spotlight Melissa under an invisible stage light. A long, heavy silence stretched out, until, for the first time during her entire shift, Melissa herself stepped forward into the center of the cabin. She stood tall, facing the passengers, her voice trembling but determined. I'd like to say a few words, if I may." The passengers slowly quieted, their whispered conversations dying down. A middle-aged man gave her a small nod of encouragement. The little girl in a floral dress hugged her teddy bear tighter, staring at her with wide, curious eyes. Melissa took a deep, shuddering breath, her palms slick with sweat. "I was wrong," she said, every word crisp and clear. "Not because Mr. and Mrs. Brooks own the airline, but because I looked at skin color, outward appearance, and gave myself the right to decide who was worthy of respect." A wave of soft murmurs and gentle nods rippled through the cabin. "I can't change what happened today," she continued, her voice cracking slightly. "But I can promise this. From this day forward, both in my work and in my personal life, I will learn to see people through eyes of fairness, not prejudice." A suffocating moment of silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, from the rear of the plane, a passenger, a man in a worn leather jacket, stood up. He began to clap, slowly but firmly, his applause echoing through the cabin like the steady beat of drums waking sleeping hearts. Like a line of dominoes falling, others began to rise. One after another, almost the entire cabin, save for a few skeptical glances, stood and clapped for her courage. Amid the growing applause, a sudden mishap jolted everyone's attention. A male passenger, while struggling to retrieve his luggage from the overhead bin, lost his grip. A loud thud cracked through the air as a heavy suitcase tumbled down, narrowly missing a young boy seated in 4C. Without a second thought, Melissa lunged forward, positioning herself between the falling suitcase and the boy. Thud! The impact slammed painfully into her shoulder, but Melissa didn't make a sound. She looked up and offered a reassuring smile to the little boy, who was clinging tightly to his mother. The mother choked up. Thank you so much." Melissa simply shook her head gently, her eyes glistening. The passengers throughout the cabin erupted into applause once again. This time, not just for her apology, but for an instinctive action that proved she was truly beginning to change. Samuel Brooks turned to glance at Helen, and a knowing smile flickered across both of their faces. No grand speeches were needed. Melissa had chosen the harder path, and had taken her first steps on it with her heart leading the way. That flight eventually took off, nearly an hour behind schedule, but not a single complaint was heard. On the contrary, many passengers later said they had witnessed something far more meaningful than any ordinary journey. Melissa Carter, though her left arm ached sharply from absorbing the blow, carried on with her duties, humbly, without a trace of her earlier arrogance. Each nod, each smile she offered to the passengers was startlingly genuine. Samuel and Helen Brooks sat quietly in the front row, occasionally exchanging glances filled with silent understanding. For them, this event wasn't merely about a personal apology. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, Samuel Brooks retrieved a slim laptop from a seat pocket. His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, drafting a special memo addressed directly to Orion Airways headquarters in Chicago. Subject: Launch of Mandatory Training Program. Respect and Bias Awareness in Customer Service. Less than 30 minutes later, the news had spread across the airline's internal network. All employees, pilots, flight attendants, and ground staff alike, would now be required to complete an urgently developed, intensive 6-month training program. And it wouldn't just be dry, theoretical lessons. The program would include real-world reenactments of incidents similar to what had just occurred, live dialogue sessions with passengers who had experienced discrimination, immersive role-play exercises forcing employees to step into others' shoes, deeply understanding the emotions and consequences. And, most striking of all, Samuel added a specific requirement that sent ripples through the company. Every employee would be asked to personally sign a pledge, admitting their unconscious biases and committing to change. To lead by example, it was decided that Melissa Carter herself would be the first to enroll in the new training program, not as punishment, but as a symbol of the ability to learn and make amends. Back in the first-class cabin of Flight, or 172, the atmosphere had softened somewhat, yet the echoes of what had just unfolded still lingered quietly in the glances of many passengers. Melissa Carter gripped the hem of her uniform tightly, taking a deep breath before resuming her duties. Gone were the mechanical gestures. Gone was the haughty, scrutinizing gaze. For the first time in her years as a flight attendant, she truly felt the heavy, sacred weight behind the word service. As she passed row 4, Melissa gently bowed and asked an elderly woman, "Ma'am, may I bring you an extra pillow or some water?" The woman, who earlier had watched Melissa with wary eyes, looked up, slightly surprised. Then she nodded, a gentle smile spreading across her wrinkled face. "Thank you, dear. A pillow would be lovely." Melissa promptly returned with a fresh, soft pillow, carefully tucking it behind the woman's back. Around her, passengers watched quietly, and their one-size stares began to soften. Continuing down the aisle to row 6, Melissa spotted a middle-aged man struggling with a seatbelt. Without hesitation, she knelt down and assisted him, murmuring, "Allow me to help you, sir." The man nodded gratefully. No one had ordered Melissa to do any of this, but she understood now. If she truly wanted to change, kindness couldn't be a forced performance. It had to come from the heart. At row 8, a little girl with sweat beading on her forehead clung tightly to her mother, frightened by the flight. Seeing this, Melissa fetched a cool cloth and gently offered it, whispering, "You're very brave. The plane's just giving us a hug, like a roller coaster ride." The girl looked up, wide-eyed, and for the first time, a flicker of comfort lit her face. Throughout the cabin, the air itself seemed to grow warmer, lighter. From their seats further ahead, Samuel and Helen Brooks watched each small gesture unfold. Helen lightly brushed her hand over Samuel's. She whispered, "Do you think she'll make it?" Samuel smiled, his eyes shining with faith. If she's willing to face the truth, anyone can become a better version of themselves. A few rows back, Melissa accidentally caught a snippet of their conversation. She clutched the food tray in her hands a little tighter, a new glimmer of resolve lighting up in eyes that had once been clouded by shame and fear. She knew the Real journey was only just beginning, and she understood that no mistake could be erased in a single flight. But at the very least, she had dared to take her first steps, with humility, with genuine respect, and with a quiet vow to herself, never again to judge anyone by appearances alone. As the Orion Airways plane gently touched down on the runway in Seattle, the afternoon sunlight streamed through the small cabin windows, casting warm golden streaks across the carpeted floor. Melissa Carter stood at the front of the cabin, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, silently watching each passenger disembark. But this time, every nod, every whispered thank you, touched her heart in a way it never had before. When Mr. and Mrs. Brooks approached, Melissa bowed deeply. "Thank you both for teaching me a lesson no textbook or training seminar could ever convey." Helen Brooks smiled gently. Samuel Brooks simply gave a slight nod, his gaze calm but weighty, offering a quiet affirmation without the need for words. They didn't say much because sometimes the most genuine forgiveness isn't spoken aloud. It lives in a glance, a simple nod, profound in its simplicity. As the last of the passengers exited and the cabin doors finally closed, Melissa remained standing, head held high, feeling something she had never truly understood before. A real pride in the work she was doing. Not the hollow self-importance of a first-class gatekeeper she once clung to, but the pride of knowing she could make others feel seen, respected, and valued, regardless of who they were, what they looked like, or where they sat. In that moment, Melissa quietly promised herself, "I will never again allow prejudice to cloud my heart or my judgment." Every passenger who boards this plane deserves to be seen with respect from the very first glance. The wide sky beyond the airport would always be shifting and changing, but deep within, Melissa Carter knew she was stepping into a journey of transformation just as vast. A journey no longer limited by invisible labels. A journey where respect would forever be the most precious boarding pass.